You're listening to Center. This week, white smoke, more like red, white, and blue smoke. We'll discuss what the Vatican's selection of the first American Pope says. And SNL's skewering of the 47th president is only getting better. But Trump saying he doesn't know if he has to uphold the Constitution is no laughing matter. Can humor help America overcome this dangerous moment? We'll ask the panel. And is State Farm's Batman vs. Bateman the best television commercial ever? Our panel: former White House and DHS spokesman Louis Miranda, former Clinton appointee and former senior Republican on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Carl Meacham, and former CBS executive, author, and publicist Jeremy Murphy. I'm Louis Miranda. Thank you for tuning in for our second episode. Last week you learned a little bit about us. Today we'll talk about our political evolution and why we started this conversation as a counterweight to the algorithm and social media-fueled extremes dominating the national conversation. But first, an American Pope. When the white smoke filled the skies over the Sistine Chapel, an American from Chicago, a graduate of Villanova, emerged as the Catholic Church's new Pope. Pope Leo XIV, though, spoke in Italian, Spanish, and even a few words in Latin, but not English. Carl, what does this election say?
Well, it's a really special, unique development, right? I mean, and particularly at a time when the U.S. has lost global standing. The election of Pope Leo offers a striking counterpoint, an American chosen not for power, but for moral leadership. And yet, ironically, his worldview clashes with the dominant political forces shaping the U.S. today. It seems that Pope Leo is a centrist. He's grounded in inclusion, bridge building, global responsibility. These are exactly the many sort of points that are opposite of the MAGA movement. And I guess some of them find it threatening. I heard Steve Bannon yesterday called him the worst pick for MAGA Catholics and the anti-Trump Pope. So that reaction says a lot. As someone who was raised Catholic, I see this as more than symbolic, right? Leo's American roots give him credibility here, but he also spent time in Peru, decades in Peru, and also his grounding in Augustinian thought, which emphasizes humility and justice and moral responsibility. These qualities reveal a leader shaped in the Americas, right? Deeply influenced by this context and the belief that faith must stand with the poor and with the marginalized. So this is a development that I think is a counterweight to our current political situation. Popes traditionally avoid domestic politics, but history tells us other narratives, right? Romero in El Salvador, Desmond Tutu in South Africa, and priests under Pinochet in Chile stepped into political currents when conscience demanded it. So today's polarized U.S., even a spiritual leader that's focused on doing the right thing, right, will be seen through a political lens. And with Vance in office and Trump aligned with hardline Catholics, Pope Leo will soon emerge, I think, as both a global voice and a domestic counterweight.
Well, yeah, certainly. I hope that we don't see a J.D. Vance Pope meeting anytime soon again. But I do think it's important what you said, that he's spent so many years in Peru, has Peruvian citizenship. To look at Peruvian media right now, you'd see that they're all embracing him as a Peruvian Pope. And I think that says a lot, because it also speaks to a moment in which the Catholic Church is seeing a steep decline in Latin America. You're seeing the Catholic Church, you touched on this, Carl, but I think it's such an important point, that the Catholic Church is positioning itself at the center, reclaiming the mantle of being there for the poor and treating the neighbor as you would treat thyself. And that's a really fascinating place to be, as you see a rise of the more extreme angles, especially in the evangelical church, getting such a strong foothold in Latin America, while on the other side of it, you see the secularism and the alienation from church that has taken root more throughout the West, really challenging the space that the church has. And yet the Catholic Church seems to be saying, we're going to double down on the center and both embrace that we can move forward in a way that is consistent with where societies are moving, and reject the conservatism that is taking root, and that really is represented by the growth of the evangelical movement throughout Latin America, but also throughout the United States.
No, that's exactly right. And you mentioned the evangelical church. You've had situations in other countries, right? In Chile, in Brazil, where the leader, in this case, people like Pinochet, people like Bolsonaro, because they're not getting support by the Catholic Church, have pivoted into finding more support from evangelicals. So, there is an interplay that is going on, not just in sort of mainstream politics, right? But there's also in the spiritual world, what the effect of this could be. I think, and we won't escape that. It's very interesting. This pick is very interesting. Obviously, the conclave has its processes, and they would probably not attribute much of this to any political calculations. But it does have these implications, and it will be very interesting to see what the dynamic is now with the policies being adopted by the Trump administration on issues where they're contrary to the beliefs of the lead pontiff of the new pope.
And I have to say, I'm relieved that America has a different face for however long this is going to go. Donald Trump is the face of America for good or bad, I think. And everybody's talking about this Pope and him being American. And I think that's really great, because we don't know how long this is going to last. I mean, Donald Trump is a one-ring circus. Others need not apply. And I'm sure he's stewing right now, trying to think how he can get back to the spotlight. And, we'll probably be invading Belgium over chocolate by the time this call is over. But, I was shocked also that the Catholic Church chose an American. I mean, I think it's really cool, because most people think, especially now, America is nationalist, protectionist. We don't play well in the sandbox. And now there's a face of America that is accepting and is loving. And, the church, I grew up Catholic, and there's a lot of stuff against the Catholic Church and whatnot, but it was always about acceptance and peace. Yeah. And I think it's really, really cool that an American finally is the face of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, and Jeremy, you also mentioned his age. He's in his late 60s, so this could go for decades.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
When it comes to exposing political realities, comedy often has the last laugh. Saturday Night Live is thriving in its 50th season. Their ability to skewer the 47th president, in no small part because of the brilliant acting, probably the best Trump impersonator that has ever taken on
100%.
Horrific job. Just an amazing job that he does. But in the cold open this week, they showed exactly what Trump is doing when he is signing executive orders. And it was really fascinating. In the cold open, they have a segment where a Stephen Miller, played by Mikey Day, to James Austin Johnson's Donald Trump, comes out to provide him with new executive orders. And the focus of the executive orders is, one, bringing back Columbus Day, a pardon for author J.K. Rowling, which of course speaks to her anti-trans rants, and reducing the number of and this is the kicker, reducing the number of interracial couples in TV commercials. James Austin Johnson playing Donald Trump says it's just too many, right? You see them in the kitchen together making a meal from HelloFresh. It was so biting and so sharp. Yep. And so it really captured. Carl, you talked about the DEI backlash that last week, and what we see is SNL really bringing to light that so much of what the Trump administration is doing is racially tinged, if not outright racist, in the way that they're carrying it out. And I think the news media has a hard time reporting on that directly, but when you see it in the comedic sketch, it really brings it to life.
Yeah. I mean, I think SNL has been brilliant. The skit was hilarious. But, it also hit me sort of in a very personal way. My parents got married 2 years after the Loving versus State of Virginia ruling, which made it legal for Black and white people to marry across the country. And that was 1967. So that wasn't that long ago. And then some states like Alabama, where my dad's from, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, didn't remove their interracial marriage bans from the books until as late as 2000. So it isn't ancient history. It's in this century. It's something, these rights can be given and they can be taken away. So yes, humor can absolutely break through. It makes people stop. It makes people pay attention, maybe even laugh before they realize that it's real. And I think that's what shows like SNL do. But also, I mean, we have a history of these things, right? All in the Family with Archie Bunker, the Jeffersons. They pushed, Americans to have these uncomfortable conversations in the mainstream. And I think today's satire is doing it different. It cracks the door open. I hope it makes a difference, but whether it makes a difference or not depends on what happens next. If it sparks deeper conversation, it can lead to understanding, but if it ends at a laugh, it's not enough, especially when policies, as you mentioned, Luis, rooted in racial resentment are coming from the highest levels. So, if we could have people in leadership that bring people together, and not shut them out. I'm seeing more and more in my feeds in social media, particularly related to immigration, guys. What Reagan said in his last address that talked about anybody from any corner of the world can come to live in America and become an American. That can't happen in any other part of the world, right? That's not what the current sort of group is showing America to be. Anyway, humor can help open the door to these discussions, but we also need courage and clarity as we deal with it. And hopefully people will get the right message from things like SNL skit.
Well, I agree with you. I think humor is the great way to level the field. Humor is what brings people together. Yeah. It's a shared laugh. It's a commonality. And it's a great way to skewer somebody and really like point out contradictions and hypocrisy. And I was really alarmed during the whole Me Too woke, that whole time where comedians were getting canceled. Because I really think of anything, comedians should have that license to push the line a little bit. Because that's how they test, like what are people thinking? Like, how far can they get away with something? Well, that means how far do people want to talk about it? So I really think comedy is essential, especially in politics. It's a great way to, point out and mock people. And that's what really, I think that's what really brings people together. It tells you where your values are.
No, I think you're right, Jeremy. And it's not like we haven't seen some of this be used politically in the past. The Smothers Brothers were taken off of there. I mean, we've had similar situations. I wonder, Luis, and I don't want to sort of pry, but I wonder how long, Saturday Night Live is going to be able to do this without getting some sort of reaction from the chief executive.
Yeah, we've certainly seen the Trump administration try to pressure media organizations into pulling back. We saw it with CBS and 60 Minutes. And 60 Minutes has had the editor of 60 Minutes resigned.
Bill Owens, yeah.
But we have seen bad instances of this. We saw a Trump event last year where a comedian using comedy as his crux called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage, which of course also incensed, rightly so, not just anyone of Puerto Rican descent, but also the broader Hispanic community, which already felt under attack by this administration. And yet you didn't see an impact of that in the general election. It didn't seem to, in fact, Trump got higher votes from Hispanics and Hispanic men than might have otherwise been expected. Mm. So, but Jeremy, isn't humor also better just another way of connecting with people at a moment when there's just so much outrage? I think one of the challenges that Democrats have right now is every single day for whatever the Trump administration is doing, the response is so much outrage that at some point it just fills up, and you can almost not fit any more outrage, and people tune out, disconnect, disengage. And I think that's probably the most dangerous thing, is if people do disengage and stop paying attention to the dangerous things that are happening. So is humor just a better way of connecting with people and getting that message out as opposed to outrage? And if it is, how do you then turn that into action?
I mean, I absolutely think humor is, because a laugh is contagious. A laugh is something that, is genuine. It comes from what you're hearing, and you can't help yourself. I mean, it's very genuine. And I remember in 2008, when Obama was going against McCain and the Sarah Palin phenomenon came. And I remember thinking, I don't think this woman's that smart. But I didn't want to say it. And I was just kind of thinking, and then when Saturday Night Live picked up on that, and Tina Fey and with Sarah Palin, I could see Russia from my house. I was like, yes, that's it. That's fun. And it affirmed what I was kind of thinking. And everybody laughed, even Republicans. And so I think when humor is spot on, when it really hits the mark, and you get everybody, humor is basically, they're telling you what you're thinking, but you're afraid to say.
In the long term, there's also the Mandela effect. I think a lot of people now think that Sarah Palin actually said it that way.
True. But that was, a lot of people were thinking that, but they didn't want to say anything because, as a woman running for, on the McCain ticket. And also, she had the adorable family and the child with Down syndrome. Like, you didn't want to mock this woman, but you're just thinking, something's not right here. And then when Saturday Night Live went on, I was like, that's it. And I think it was funny, but it was very effective too, because I think it kind of told people what you're thinking is right.
I think the challenge is in capitalizing on it. We look at looking back at the ads from 2024. I don't think that there was enough humor used. I think that may be a way to counteract. When you look back at 2024, we talked last week about the very damaging ad that the Trump administration used during Super Bowls, during other sporting events, to really try to connect with people on a fear of cultural change that they were seeing. And when you look at some of the more popular ads, or some of the ones that got the most attention, the Kamala campaign did have good ads. They had very localized ads that they would call, for example, Philly versus Trump, Detroit versus Trump, Milwaukee versus Trump, that were all personalized to that city in a very excellent way to contrast what that city's values might be against Trump, and to make him the scary candidate, or at least the one that you wouldn't want to be grabbing a beer with. And what's interesting, though, is it didn't work in any of those places. Maybe very hyper locally in cities, but it didn't work in the state more broadly. Which is part of the reason that we saw the Rust Belt fall away. And so I wonder if campaigns can take a little bit out of SNL's playbook and start to try to connect with their audiences in a way that's more engaging and more dynamic and more fun and more connected to their daily lives, instead of just thinking Trump is the boogeyman and that's what we're going to go with, because it hasn't worked, as you said, Jeremy, last week. And so is that something that campaigns need to be looking at, is how do we just make this more fun again? Make America fun again?
Well, I think that we're going to have trouble because, the head of the FCC has basically made it clear that if media entities don't fall in line with everything the Trump administration wants, the FCC is not going to greenlight any mergers or station transfer licenses. So anytime you're talking about television, you're talking over-the-air television, you have an administration that is not shy about using the FCC to come down on them. So I think we're going to see the opposite. I mean, there's been great comedy, but I think it's going to go the other way. I think people are going to really run and hide because they have to get their message out and they don't want to poke the bear.
Yeah, but this is the sort of thing where you would find humor resonating sort of with a critical mass of Americans. And one of the things Absolutely. That I think is sort of the issue, and you, I hope you agree, but more of what we're seeing right now is along partisan lines. You have the Gutfield humor on Fox, and it's strictly sort of tailored to, the MAGA world. And then, you have the sort of response on sort of the Comedy Central approach.
Jon Stewart.
Yeah, Jon Stewart. Why am I blanking?
That whole crew on the Daily Show is just brilliant in their daily analysis.
But the issue there is that the background assumptions of the folks that they are focused on are very different. The issues that we had in the past, with a Richard Pryor or the folks that did All in the Family, right, was that it cut across these divisions. And I don't see anybody cutting across the divisions. I think the SNL stuff was hilarious. But, I don't know if folks who are in, Wichita or folks that are in, rural Texas would look at that and laugh the same way. And what I'm hoping is that, just because of what Jeremy said, because I think there is a threat here, Jeremy, and it is harder for folks to come out with their material. But if something comes out that cuts across both lines, and people just, that it resonates with both sides, that's when it really becomes dangerous. That's when it becomes subversive, but they can't turn it off anymore. So,
well, and
I
also think, absolutely, you're right on that. And I also think, we're talking about Saturday Night Live and sketch comedy, that they have airtime, that Saturday Night Live opening skit was like 8 or 9 minutes. Yeah. And they have the best writers, political ads, 30 seconds tops. If you go over a minute, so you have to get to try to get a really funny message, well written in a 30-second ad that's going to cut across is very difficult. I don't think
it's really 15 seconds now when you look at the digital ads.
Yeah, so it's asking a lot of political ads. Yeah. It would be great to see more humor, clever humor that cuts across. Yeah. But I think in 15, 30 seconds, I think that's a hard call.
Well, let me ask you a question then for both of you guys. SNL, there is a profile of who watches SNL, and there's a profile of who watches Gutfield and Jon Stewart. There's a profile. Is the delivery, mechanism now the more important one? Which one would cut across? Is it TikTok? Is it Substack? Is it, YouTube? What cuts across that ensures that a critical mass on both sides sees it?
I would say Facebook, because Facebook, as lame as people is, and it's kind of a garbage pail when you think of all the ads and how they junk it up. But that is one that cuts across all the age groups. Mm-hmm. The people I grew up with read it. My mom read it. Her older friends read it, and younger people, they say they don't, but of course they're on it.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's more meta though, because I think the power of advertising through Facebook is not that you're just reaching the people who tend to lean a little bit on the older side now in terms of the demographic, but because Meta has so many other vehicles through their advertising channels, you're going to hit people through Instagram and other aspects where it's going to have actually pretty deep impact. So I do think you're right about Meta broadly. And I think the reality is that older people still do vote at much higher percentages.
Yep.
And so certainly Facebook still makes a difference. But that raises a really interesting question, which is, to me, when you look at the power of social media and the digital environment that we're in, one of the benefits is that you can micro-target everything so closely. Even the ads that I was just talking about, it was Milwaukee versus Trump, Philly versus Trump, Detroit versus Trump. That's very hyper-localized. But I think part of what we're missing is also that broader, bigger, deeper message that cuts across no matter who you are and where you are, and that speaks not just to the hatred of what you see happening from the far right and the anger and frustration that we have at the way that they're whether dismantling the government or damaging the country in a number of ways. And you have to get to a point where you actually give people a little bit of hope. And I think that's got to be broader. And that's also part of where I think humor can play a role, is in uniting us around broader themes. I mean, right now you think about what are the actions that we're seeing people take. There's protest, which is good. If people peacefully protest and step out and participate in peaceful demonstrations, that is a good thing. That is what democracy is all about, is the freedom of speech, the freedom to protest. I think where you have a problem is where you see some of the frustration boil over and turn into the burning or attacking of Teslas. I don't like anything that Elon Musk has done in terms of Doge, the damage that he's causing, and the way that Doge is trying to appropriate itself of all of Americans' sensitive information, how they might use that in the future. A lot to be concerned about there. But when you see videos online of someone driving a Tesla and getting harassed by other drivers, that doesn't make sense. That's going to be an easy ad to use in 2026 to scare run-of-the-mill voters, because you don't know when that person bought that Tesla. They might not have a sticker on it yet that says, I bought this before Elon did what he did, but you can't be harassing people because of the vehicle that they drive. And I think when we get to that point, we get into a much more divisive and difficult place, and we have to make that change. I mean, I look back when you think about humor in a campaign context that is just not just advertising. In 1992 was when we first saw the chicken chasing around George Bush all over because he was refusing to a debate. And that chicken, that individual in a chicken costume that showed up at campaign events and all over the place, that was funny. And it was a good way of how campaigns can find creative, funny ways to exploit their opposition. I remember in 1999, the Republican National Committee invited people to come see the computer at the RNC headquarters where Al Gore invented the internet. There was a lot of humor right now around that, not right now, back then, about this idea that Al Gore had said that he invented the internet, and they were able to capitalize on that in a very humorous way. But I think it is important to try to figure out, how do we channel people's energy constructively, give them a sense of hope, give them a sense of laughter, and make this a competition that they feel they want to engage in. Because if we keep driving towards anger towards Tesla, anger towards everything else that's happening, I think we also lose a little bit of ourselves in that process if we don't find a way to channel that more constructively.
I think the telling of the stories is Luis, I think you're going right with the issues of political relevance and the use of humor in campaigns, which I think you're exactly right. But what I'm focusing more is on telling the story of the problems that exist. The All in the Family, I'll pick on that. They had these episodes on the war in Vietnam or on segregation, right? Wouldn't it be great if we had a very honest discussion with humor about, people being expelled, people being kicked out of the country, and having the two views. And so people can actually understand the underpinnings of the arguments, and you put it in a humoristic sort of environment, it makes it easier for people to understand it. Or what you said about segregation and the DEI. Man, imagine if we had a discussion with people that are trans about the issue of sports and trans, people that are for it and against it, in a context that's more humor focused. Those tellings of stories, I think, is what we're missing right now, because everyone seems to be just focused on their tribe. Nobody steps out of their tribe, and nobody tries to understand the viewpoints of the other tribe, and that's why we're stuck. But I think humor can go a long way if it is something that's inclusive and not just, going after the other side.
I agree with that. And one of the things when people talk about, well, what are the platforms people are on, or how do we reach them, like Facebook, Meta, TikTok, humor? And, I think a lot of that is coded. We need to get more young people, more, people who are engaged. I'll tell you what, I don't want more young people. I think they're idiots. I don't think the young people are the great fountain of youth that is going to change politics and make it more loving and Care Bears and friendly. I don't think that's going to happen.
No, look, Jeremy, you make a really interesting point that the problem that exists every generation is that you have young people who are coming up and looking at the world and saying, wait a second, I don't know that I agree with the way that the prior generations have been dealing with things. And I've been involved in politics now for a quarter century. And, the first presidential campaign that I worked on was Al Gore's. And you had Bill Bradley run a very spirited campaign from what was then the far left. I think Bill Bradley would be center right by today's standards. But he ran, former basketball star, very popular guy, ran a very spirited campaign. 2004, I was working for John Kerry, and we had Howard Dean in an upstart campaign that very much capitalized on this movement against the war in Iraq. And so young people getting mobilized and energized by the issue of the day is nothing new, and I think is a good thing. But I certainly think that part of the challenge that we have is to transition what are some of the broader contexts that we need people considering when they step into a voting booth, and what are the repercussions. For whatever reason, we saw young people increase their support for Donald Trump. You saw Trump's support among 18 to 29-year-olds get close to 50%. That's incredible.
Maybe this helps pivot into sort of what got us involved in public service and in politics, et cetera. But Jeremy, I talk to my kids about what's happening now, and our point of reference, I think Luis's and mine, is coming from countries that had, serious confrontation and polarization, political polarization, right? Chile and Colombia, for different reasons, right? And you talk to them about, rights and rule of law and the conversations that are happening about singling out certain populations of this country. And what are you going to do about it? And they're not so concerned. And I think they're not so concerned because there are so many distractions now that we didn't have, that Luis and I didn't have, or Jeremy, you didn't have as well, that, make having discussions about social issues and social justice issues, it just pushes it to another plane. So, if folks say, oh, Donald Trump is more authoritarian, they ask you, how is he more authoritarian and how does that affect me? My life hasn't changed. I still can go to CVS. I can still go party. I can buy whatever I want to on the internet. No one's stopping me from saying whatever I want. That's how they view it.
In a very technical reality is that we have both the left and the right walking away from the democratic principles that are the underpinning of what we've grown up with. And I think part of that is that, the center was able to dominate American politics for so long. And there was really hurdles to participation that I think over the last 20 years, with the increase of social media and technology and the ability for people to have their voices heard, there's good things in that. More people are participating in the process. That's a positive. But of course, that also means that more extreme voices enter the dialogue. And I think one of the challenges that we have is that nobody is defending liberal democracy anymore. Nobody is standing up and saying, hey, the reason that our country has thrived is because we've stood up a system of liberal democracy that respects civil rights, individual liberties, that respects a market economy, that gives people the opportunity to thrive, that frankly has instituted some guardrails to ensure that it's not just a complete capitalist system that has no protections. It does have some protections, and that has allowed us to thrive. And the danger that I see right now is that on both ends there is a distancing from that. You see it very strongly from the Trump administration. We touched on this at the very top of this episode. This past week, Donald Trump saying that he's not sure if he has to uphold the Constitution in an interview last Sunday with Kristen Walker of NBC's Meet the Press. He's not sure.
He's not sure about a lot of things.
This is a man who took an oath of office. Look, I took the oath of office too when I entered into government service, and it's pretty clear. You're there to uphold the Constitution, and the reason that our government has thrived and that our country has thrived is because we've had a government that's there not for the individual, but to uphold this form of government that gives everyone the right. And by the way, when it comes to freedom of speech, I think it's important to recognize that means that there's going to be speech that you disagree with. And to your point earlier, Jeremy, that means, you don't get to cancel everyone.
When they serve Donald Trump his triple cheeseburger, they should do the placemat, like a coloring thing about the Constitution and what it means, because it's the only way you're going to get through to him.
Yeah, but no, the issue, Luis, I think you're exactly right, but it's not attractive or interesting to anybody because they take it for granted. That's one. The other issue is that the discussion about compromise. Nobody wants to talk about compromise, Luis. Nobody wants to talk about the issues that make our system special, right? Again, I'll go back to the Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, the Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich. I mean, these are folks that didn't agree on a whole bunch of different issues, but they were safeguarding the system. I mean, I think the Newt Gingrich today is very different than the Newt Gingrich in the mid 90s. They respected the system. What we are seeing now, though, is that there's sort of this lack of outrage. So if the president says he is wondering if he does support or not the Constitution for certain people, nobody's outraged. That those things would have caused a reaction, just not too far ago, not too long ago. That today they don't, and I think that's sort of the issue. Going back to what Jeremy was saying before about his lack of enchantment with the current generation, that they don't seem to be motivated to safeguard these principles, and that's the big concern.
And we had, a reality. I know when we were growing up, you had the Soviet Union was a real threat, and so I think that gave you pause, and it gave you a need to stop and think about what the world really looked like. And I think the challenge that we have right now is that a lot of people have not seen the results and the positive benefits of democracy in a way that they can translate, especially if you're a millennial. You've lived through how many crises now? Whether it was the economic collapse in 2008, the attacks of September 11th, and certainly everything else that we've seen since. It's a constant sense of crisis and instability. Housing prices are out of control. You can't get into the housing market the way that somebody's grandparents could have just a few decades ago with reasonable jobs. You're talking about people who, even with two incomes, with a family that has sometimes 2.5 incomes, can't even afford to buy a home. And I think those challenges are very real and need to be addressed. But the resulting indifference to constitutional and democratic norms, and the willingness to say my side is right, and that means that nobody is entitled to a different opinion, I think is as prevalent on the far left as it is on the far right, and just as problematic. And I think, Carl, you mentioned this. I was born in a country where those extremes took hold, and there was a multi-decade civil war. Mm-hmm. And so I've seen the damage and the violence and the vitriol and the just lack of respect for human life that takes hold when people don't care about upholding those norms and those institutions and finding common ground and finding the ability to compromise. There are real and ugly consequences to that. And that's why I'm a centrist. That is a big part. I also grew up, in South Florida by way of New York and New Jersey. And in South Florida, you have very diverse communities. And so I certainly grew up around people who were Republican, people who were Democrats, people who were Jewish, Black, white, you name it. And one of the things that when I first got to Washington that I thought was like, I wasn't as partisan as I think I became later. And when I got to Washington, I got here and I realized, look, whoever controls Congress, whoever controls the majorities, sets the tone for what's happening. I remember in the late 90s, we went from a Congress that was debating a patient's Bill of Rights to make sure that people got better health care to one that was focused on tax cuts for the rich. And that's the difference. And that's why I became more of an ardent Democrat and went to work to help elect leaders who would uphold and defend those types of ideals that would focus more on trying to get somebody health care as opposed to trying to get the wealthy tax cuts. That's what did it for me. But when I look now, I see very much that we have to help people on both sides find a way back to the center, because if your position is it's my way or the highway, we're only going to see a further dissolution of the norms that allow us to actually thrive and have the kind of democracy and stability that we should want for ourselves and for our children.
I also think there's a cost-benefit analysis here where you see, when Trump first got elected the first time, you saw all those wonderful marches. Women came all around the country to protest this. And there was a sense that this could be like a civil rights moment. This could be something like that. And guess what? The man got reelected again. So I think a lot of those people who are protesting are thinking, that really didn't work so well for us. You know what? or we might have gotten 30 minutes or whatever. But yeah, not really.
And you know what? Joe Biden did his media comeback this week. He was out doing the rounds on BBC and other outlets. And he made a point that we were a little too successful. And he's not wrong on that. I think one of the challenges of the Biden administration was that there was tremendous legislative success in passing his agenda. But the benefits of that take much longer to see. And I think people just didn't connect to it or forgot about it. And I think that's certainly a challenge, is that you're too successful, so people easily forget what they just went through over the prior 4 years.
Right.
We have incredibly short political memories when it comes to electing presidents in this country.
But I'll go back to a little bit about what Luis was saying and sort of how we became centrists, right? For me, sort of the guiding rule is basically that democracy is fragile. And I grew up in Chile during Pinochet, and I had family members that were on the militant left, and I had family members that were ardent Pinochet supporters. And Sunday afternoon lunches were just, a clash of titans. And I always was able to pick the points from both sides that were positive or that were good points and that needed to be discussed. So I kind of survived in that framework. And then when I got here, I first worked with Bill Clinton, who I believe was in the same line of being able to talk to, as he would say, a little blue and a little red, and understand the viewpoints of folks that he was working with that he necessarily didn't agree with. And when I became a Republican with Senator Lugar, it was the same thing, but in the realm of foreign affairs, where we did need to strengthen the multilateral system, and we needed to use that as a tool for good to advance American interests, but also the world. So for me, it's very much rooted in this ability to empathize with the other side, which is something that I don't see happening very much today. You've seen it with people, and I won't label them, but you've seen it with people with things like gay marriage, right? As long as you have a daughter or a son who's gay, then you can sympathize with gay marriage. But you can't understand someone who has a son or a daughter who's trans, or who marries a black person, or who marries a Muslim, right? That lack of empathy is something that I think both parties have. And I think that we need to sort of step in to highlight, the issues that make us all sort of Americans. This is a country that's focused not on ethnicity, but on beliefs. And those beliefs are what are at stake right now and today. So when we look at all of these situations, we need to be reminded. And I think, this issue about us being centrists is key, because we're able to see how the other side sees things. We don't agree sometimes on things, but we're more focused on maintaining a reality which allows for that, which allows for difference, which allows for the protection of the minority viewpoint, which allows for compromise, which allows for, abiding by the rule of law, which is supposed to affect us all the same way, because we all have the same rights in this country. And that's what's being threatened. So, when we come to this discussion, Luis, I think our background assumptions are super important. I do believe that it's up to us right now, and that we're sort of the protectors of this, because we can see the two sides, or three or four.
Well, look, I'll say this, that I think when I bought into the melting pot idea of America, I bought into that because America was supposed to be an idea. It was supposed to be a place where we came together from all over the world and became one, united around these ideals of democracy, freedom, respect for other ideas, or at least that they could be expressed, even if we didn't agree with them. That is what I think is also a threat right now, because the more I see of the next generation, there's more polarization among different groups. Everybody's sort of self-segregating. And look, you talked about the DEI backlash. And by the way, I'll say that a lot of people consider this DEIA because it's diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, because it also affects the norms that we've put in place over the last few decades to make sure that Americans with disabilities have access to things. That's also what's been under threat in recent days. But one of the challenges with diversity, equity, and inclusion is that it went from being a effort to make sure that people who had traditionally been kept out of the centers of power, of the ability to not just sit in the boardroom, but be able to have a voice, not just participate in politics, but take on leadership roles. And I think one of the challenges on the left that has taken hold is this idea where minorities are invited to participate, but oftentimes it is strictly for the purpose of that effort of DEIA. And that, I think, is a problem. If you hire someone on the left and their job is entirely to talk to people who look like themselves, you have failed at the equity and inclusion part of DEI.
I think Democrats have no one to blame but themselves. I think they completely overreach. I think most people agreed with the tenements of woke of equality and everything. And I think progressives, they really overreached and they started canceling people that didn't believe what they believe. And this is the end result. So I think Democrats really need to look in the mirror, because this is an effect of how they went really far with.
But I don't think it's just overreaching, because I think the reality is that when you look at what people are asking for in the political space, it's essentially, 6 decades after Selma, what you have is a lot of people on the left asking for a separate lunch counter. That's what it equates to. We need someone to work on African American outreach. We need someone to work on Hispanic outreach. We need someone to work on Asian American. And what that's become, it's been used as a tool to marginalize people within the professional left, and to keep them focused on just those communities. And so the idea of the melting pot that I grew up with, you have a reality where the melting pot has gone away. And so even though I am Colombian American, because I have a Colombian ancestry and I was born there, but I see myself as an American. And when I worked for the U.S. government, my position was entirely, how do I best represent the U.S. government and the positions of the government that I work for? Never in my mind did I introduce myself as Colombian or as anything other than I'm an American who's here to represent the U.S. government and do the best job that I can in that role. And I think that's changing as we see more of that, not just polarization, but fragmentation of different communities, where people are beginning to, and in part, again, I think it's a problem of the left, where people have been bucketed to work specifically on outreach in certain areas. And when I started in politics, I remember 20 years ago, somebody telling me, look, the reality is if you have a Democrat who's president, you'll never see a Latino in a major cabinet role like Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense. That was true back then. And, they'll give us HUD, they'll give us education, but they won't give us the big national security agencies. And it took George W. Bush to put Alberto Gonzales as Attorney General, and to put Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell as African American Secretaries of State. And so I think that's a fascinating dynamic that happens, that when you have less diversity, oddly, on the Republican side, they've promoted people better in many ways than within the Democratic side, where they have fragmented it to the point of diluting the impact of these communities and the people who arguably come from those communities, but that are just as good or just as worthy of leadership roles as anyone else. But I think that's a problem.
Why do you think that is? I mean, this goes to a real issue. And I don't want to say it's prejudice, but that question which you highlighted, Black people in the Democratic Party, if they were interested in foreign affairs, or if they were interested in anything that wasn't civil rights or housing, they were diverted in another direction. And then you talked about the Republican side, and Colin Powell for me was a hero. And he might have made mistakes with the Iraqi war and the UN hearing and all that, but who hasn't in these positions? But because of his sort of larger than life persona, he was able to prosper, period. And then, he became, I think, a supporter of President Biden's and Secretary Clinton's in the last elections. But I would just wonder, because I do think that the Republican Party has, particularly now, you get into these conversations about segregation and bigotry, and everyone seems to look at the Republican Party as if they're the owners of this segregation, when you've had similar situations in the Democratic Party, maybe in a different framework, and you also can't ignore the history of the Democratic Party turning and becoming sort of the prime mover during the civil rights movement, right? And the Republican Party, how it flipped because of the Southern strategy. But it's a lot more complicated, is what I think, with both parties and these issues of integration. You talked about Latinos, Alberto Gonzalez being, the first attorney general during a Republican administration. Why did it happen that way? What is your insight on the issues within the Democratic Party as well?
I worked against him for 8 years, so I'm loath to quote him here, but George W. Bush coined it as the soft bigotry of low expectations. Mm-hmm. The soft bigotry of low expectations. And I think he was onto something there, that there's this idea that we're going to be inclusive when we're going to let people into the room, but, sit where you're told and don't rock the boat. And that's a real problem. That is a real problem. And I think power is not going to be granted to you. You're going to have to take it. And that's, I think, where this newer generation is coming from, is this idea that nobody's going to ever grant us power. Nobody's going to do the things that we think need to be done if we let the old guard stick around. And look, and I think this is where AOC has a really tremendous shot, whether she runs against Schumer or runs for president, is that she has been able to tap into that side of the movement, which is saying we're tired of being told to wait our turn and only talk to our community and only do this or that. And it's time for us to take control for ourselves. And I think she'll benefit from that because she's very good at tapping into that energy. Now, do I think she's the right candidate? We'll save that for another episode. Again, obviously, we're coming at this from the center, so I think you know the answer. But the reality is that there is something strong there that is a reaction to where Democrats have fallen. And on the right, there certainly seem to be against everyone, but somehow people, when they rise, they give them the space. You have Marco Rubio now what is he? He's got 5 jobs. He's Secretary of State, National Security Council lead, National Security Council advisor. He's the acting director of USAID. Donald Trump had no love for him during the 2016 election. And yet he's been able to sort of climb his way in there and has his influence seems to be growing in this administration. Whether that's good or bad is yet to be seen.
I would note that Barack Obama is an example of that, taking the party by storm and taking influence in not waiting his turn. And you remember better than anybody, probably, Luis, the conflicts that the Clinton campaign had with Barack Obama when he just stepped up and just passed them. I do agree with a lot of what you're saying. One of the issues is you can't focus on a voting bloc just because of the assumptions based on their color or their ethnicity. I think that's what we've learned with the Trump success with Black men in particular, and with Latino. I think with Latino men more than women.
Barack Obama is the example of not waiting your turn, building his own movement. When he became president, he really invested in a parallel structure through Organizing for America that in many ways competed with and kind of minimized what the National Party could do, or at least the impact that they could have. And I think you saw the impacts of that continue to haunt Democrats for a long time in sort of how the party has for a long time struggled to sort of pull itself back together. So there are unintended consequences there. We've seen it from David Hogg, the vice chair of the Democratic Party, who is a very young man, part of this Gen Z generation that is arguing for running candidates against Democrats, even as a member of the DNC, that he thinks are ineffective or that his coalition believes are ineffective. I have concerns that while that's an important approach in many ways to bring in new voices, it also does what Republicans did from 2010 to 2016. We saw them run a series of incredibly difficult candidates, actually as early as 2006, when we were able to win back control of the Senate in no small measure because Republicans were running candidates that were so far to the right that we were able to get somebody like a Jim Webb elected in Virginia, who was the vote that put us over the top on winning the majority in the Senate. Senators like John Tester in Montana, who are much more moderate. Those kinds of people won because Republicans were running candidates so far to the right. And I think Democrats risk doing the same thing if they follow the David Hogg model. But at the same time, is it a great opportunity to start bringing in new voices and to test new candidates and to get new people engaged? Absolutely. I think it can come with consequences.
I think that the equation or that the context that Democrats face is different than that of Republicans. I think that the Democrats, and you might have a different view, Luis, but I think that Democrats are constantly struggling to move to the middle in this environment. And I think Republicans are just pulling to the right, and they've been successful that way. And I think that it's important to sort of highlight also that the process is much more organic than what I think a lot of folks at the DNC think. So if Hogg is trying to put rules, et cetera, I understand his viewpoint in trying to get new voices and new people in, which is, I think everybody wants that. But I don't think it's going to be as structured. And I think that what will end up being more appealing to a critical mass of Americans is not sort of an ideological belief in X, Y, or Z, but it's something that they can relate to. So when you look at Governor Beshear, when you look at Governor Whitmer, these are characters that are struggling more within the Democratic caucus because of some of the things that they've done and policies that they've enacted than, let's say, the equivalent would be in the Republican Party. And this is something that Democrats are always struggling with. I think that Democrats who lean to the center are actually stronger in this situation than one that is more pure that embodies the purity of democratic beliefs, let's say, and sort of isolates or runs the risk of isolating what the critical mass of Americans believe. So I think it's a challenging situation, and we're yet to see, this be defined. But the things that you're talking about in the run up to this are incredibly important. I think someone's going to pop up that we're not thinking of right now. And I think it's going to be more so than from the states than from the party framework that's being devised.
Well, to close out today's episode, we talked about political advertising, but we're seeing some genius advertising taking place on television, and we're going to make a regular segment out of looking at which ads are working and why. Today, Bateman. You're seeing some of the images from the ad on screen right now. It is a State Farm ad that brings pop culture and insurance together with a really fascinating campaign. And the concept is brilliant, which is basically to say, look, when you need Batman, you don't want Bateman. You don't want basically cut rate insurance.
Well, I thought the ad was brilliant in its simplicity and in using, comic book, action adventure, science fiction, those a superhero to tell a story. And very simple, the real superhero is who you want when there's danger, and same with insurance. It's important who you call. You don't want the discount insurance company. You want the one that's reliable, that's going to save the day. And I think that's the message that's there. And it was done very clever and sardonic and witty. And Jason Bateman is a fantastic choice because he's like the thought bubble in your head, the guy who has a deadpan, quippy comment. That's he's a master at irony, and
I think they used all those elements, and the superhero thing is something that resonates with everybody. Like even our grandparents grew up reading comic books, and then we grew up watching the cartoons and then the movies, and it's a great storytelling technique. So I think State Farm really hit it home, and I love the science fiction thing because I was watching recently Star Wars, the first one or the fourth one, however they want to put it in the timeline, where you see the big Death Star. The rebels exploded it from the previous one. And I'm looking at that, and the first thing I thought of was, that's going to be one hell of an insurance claim. I wonder who's going to pay for that one. So I thought that this was a very tongue-in-cheek, clever way of sending their message.
Jason Bateman, of course, is someone that those of us of our generation recognize immediately. Whether you loved him from his days on Valerie in the 1980s or Teen Wolf 2, and they're targeting that demographic very, very well. My sister is sold, I'll tell you that. But it's a brilliant commercial. It was developed by an agency called High Dive, directed by Brian Buckley. But what I see now, too, is they have a lot of folks that I didn't recognize. They have Grammy-winning artist SZA as Catwoman. I didn't realize that was her. In Washington, SZA, you think cybersecurity infrastructure security agency. It's a brilliant ad and really speaks to the idea that you can lean in on humor, pop culture references, and just simple concepts.
It gets your attention, and it more importantly, it gets you curious in the product. And I think that what it's done is that it's sort of an all-encompassing approach to this. It's not just focused on one demographic. It's very broad. For me, I mean, Batman is my favorite, and The Dark Knight is one of those classics for me. But I truly think that the more you can make publicity, right, that hits on a lot of different sort of demographics, the better it is for what you're trying to sell. And I think that the Bateman campaign does that quite effectively.
And I think it's particularly brilliant too, just right now when you see the advertising industry struggling with what the political industry is struggling with, which is how do you cut through at a moment when not everyone is watching TV? Streamers are having to revert to get advertising on, so that's certainly helping. But how do you make things interesting enough to catch people's attention at a moment when the attention spans are just all over the place? And a 2-second video on TikTok that has absolutely no production value can potentially just go mega viral. And so how do you compete with that? How do you stay relevant? How do you make it pop? And I think they succeeded very well because they touched on all those cultural points and made it so funny and so interesting and makes people want to share it. And I think that's also what's effective.
Tell a story. Keep it simple, stupid. Tell a story. This is caveman days, and use somebody who has cultural cachet.
Very well done, and we look forward to looking at more of these in the upcoming episodes. So, Carl, Jeremy, thank you for joining. Thanks, everyone who listened today, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Centered. Subscribe and stay tuned